From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. It's become well known and documented the important role that young African-American students here in Nashville played in the leadership and development of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s. What is perhaps not as well known or documented, at least until now, is the critical role another young black man here in Nashville, Perry Wallace, played about that same time in desegregating college basketball, particularly one of the major college sport conferences in the country, the Southeastern Conference. Our guest today on Inside Politics is Andrew Maraniss. He's the author of Strong Inside, Perry Wallace and the Collision of Race and Sports in the South. He's our guest today on Inside Politics, along with the subject of his book, Perry Wallace, who's now a law professor at American University in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on today, both of you.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
Andrew, what drew you to write this book? Is this really the ultimate dream that this came out of some sort of term paper assignment that you had?
Yeah, believe it or not, it's the one thing I remember from the classroom in college. It was 25 years ago when I was 19 years old, sophomore at Vanderbilt, that I first heard Perry Wallace's name, reading about him in a student magazine article. And soon after reading that, I was taking a black history course at Vanderbilt at the time. I called up Perry, who was a professor at the University of Baltimore, and interviewed him for a term paper. And then I interviewed him for another term paper, and I interviewed him for several columns for the Vanderbilt Hustler student newspaper. And so, going back 25 years. And then it was 8 years ago that I had the idea, hey, this could be a book too. And so, here we are today, 8 years later.
Now, given all the interest in books that have been recently, particularly about sports pioneers, particularly in the Jackie Robinson situation with Major League Baseball, were you surprised when you got into this, particularly to write an actual definitive biography about this particular era, that no one had written a comprehensive history of Perry Wallace at all in this situation?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I was surprised because of the strength of the story that it hadn't already done, although I felt, in some ways very lucky that I had the opportunity to do it. In some ways, no, because there are a lot of people who have never gotten the due that they deserve, in history, especially when it comes to issues like civil rights. So, unfortunately, it wasn't surprising in that regard.
Perry, were you surprised in all these years that nobody had really come and said, gee, I want to tell your story in some detail, not just necessarily a single newspaper article, maybe a series of articles?
Well, somewhat surprised, because I felt that it was significant and that it would be interesting and enlightening to people. So I think you're right on that. I was surprised over the years, but at a certain point you stop being surprised.
Perry, the book indicates that you weren't born with a basketball in your hand. In fact, it sort of indicates you didn't start even playing basketball or even dribbling a ball until you were 10. Mm-hmm. When the ball got in your hands, did something just kind of click and suddenly became one of your most important things in your life, along with, I understand, playing the trumpet?
Well, I liked it. I really liked it, and playing the game, going down on the playground and playing with guys who were good players. And then also at that time we started having televised games, the NBA games, and I saw Chamberlain and Russell, and I think altogether that was it.
Now, Andrew, if you saw Perry Wallace play, he had tremendous leaping abilities, but he was not born necessarily with a natural God-given talent. Talk about how he developed his great leaping abilities.
Yeah, well, Perry told me a story about Wilt Chamberlain coming to town, and Perry saw an exhibition game here in Nashville, and Wilt was dunking as he did, and that made such an impression on a young Perry Wallace. And so he would come home, and he told me that he would sit in your parents' living room and while they were watching TV, yes, and just do deep knee bends and practice leaping at door frames, and every chance he got, he was working on his body to improve his strength. And then out on the playground, he and his friends would practice, from a long running start across the blacktop driveway, or basketball court, day after day after day, until finally they could do it.
Now, Andrew, you attended Vanderbilt. You became more and more aware of Perry Wallace. As you got into this book, what surprised you most about what you learned about Perry and about the experiences he had?
As a student writing about Perry, like a lot of young men, I guess, I was just sort of a sports nut, and so I was interested in the basketball side of Perry's story. The deeper I got into the book, it became so much more obvious that there was so much more than that. And so the civil rights aspect to the story became very interesting to me.
Now, Perry, I'm sure you got the manuscripts to look at this when it was coming towards the finishing part of it.
Yes.
When you read the book for the first time, What did you think? Did you see yourself there? Did this capture your story?
I did, and that was proof of how fine a job Andrew did. Obviously, he asked for my input and my reactions and recommendations, but it was just amazing how well he got me, and he got the Times. And there's so many times when I would, in talking to Andrew, want to say, well, you remember when so-and-so, and I was thinking, no, you weren't even born.
He wasn't a glimmer in his parents' eyes at that time.
He was, that's exactly so, and I think that's the greatest statement when you want to say, well, do you remember back in '68 when X and X happened?
Well, does this bring back good memories for you, but also some not so good memories? You had a very difficult time in those 4 years at Vanderbilt, not only when you were on the court and on the road, but even when you were on campus.
Oh, absolutely. Good times and bad times. But, surprise, surprise, surprise about life, where even in the best of circumstances, you're going to have good times and bad times. And if you look back, and especially if you look back to help in the creation of a product that is factual, that tells the truth, then you have to accept that. But there were times when I was really taken aback, and I struggled a bit with some of these stories.
The book talks a lot about some of the road trips you made within the conference, when you, particularly the Mississippi State trip when you were a freshman, and then also at Ole Miss.
Sure.
You got hit in the Ole Miss game in the eye with an elbow. No foul was called. You were bleeding, taken off the court. You had to come back by yourself almost in the second half. You did help Vanderbilt win that game. But as you've gotten older, do you still have flashbacks about those things? Do you dream about that or have nightmares about that at night? Does it still live with you, or have you kind of managed to find a way to come to peace with it, and it's kind of moved on within your life and your psyche?
The latter. Now, what happens is that, and that's just one of the reasons that we wanted this book to be an educational piece for people about many, many different challenges that you may have very, very tough experiences and traumatic ones, but the idea is that you got to go to work on them. You can't do it if you don't face them. So you can't run away from them because they come back in your dreams, and but you work on them, work them through, and then what happens is that it's all right. I don't have any nightmares or anything else about that experience.
We're talking with Perry Wallace. He's the man who broke the color barrier in the Southeastern Conference in basketball back in the late 1960s. Andrew Maraniss is also our guest. He's the author of the book about Perry Wallace called Strong Inside: The Collision of Race and Sports in the South. Back to continue our conversation with both these gentlemen after this break.